Hello, welcome to my presentation on comfort in screens, the emotional and social impacts of watching content while eating. Before we start, I would like to take a moment to introduce myself. My name is Aswaitha. Previously, I completed my undergrad in psychology in India. I'm currently a full-time student on the MSc in Theories of Counseling program. Alongside my MSc, I've had the pleasure of volunteering with the Buddy Project, Spectrum, and Omega. I've had a great opportunity of collaborating on this project with Half, Lakshmi Priya, and Nivedita. Here's a quick overview of what I'll be covering in this presentation. I'll begin with previous studies in this area, followed by why the study matters. Then I'll share my research question and hypothesis, and I'll walk you through the method I used, the results I found, and the key points from the discussion. I'll also touch on the study's limitation, suggest some direction for further research, and wrap up with the reference. So I'll start by explaining what we know so far. Studies have shown that simply eating with someone else, even if there is no conversation happening, strengthens social bonds and amplifies positive experience. There seems to be something about just being together at a table that does us good almost without us noticing. The second one comes from what's called the social surrogacy hypothesis. This is the idea that screen content like a favorite TV show or a beloved character can give us a felt sense of company and briefly ease loneliness. It's not the same as having a real person there, of course, but the brain responds in a surprisingly similar way. The third finding pulls in a slightly different direction. Studies have linked heavy or passive digital media use with greater loneliness and lower well-being. Though importantly, these effects depends a lot on how the media is being used. Active use tends to look quite different from passive scrolling. And finally, this is where my study sits. A study introduced a term digital commensality. It captures the way that technology is now reshaping how we eat. And critically, they call for more research on the psychological side of eating with screens, which is the exact gap this project tries to begin to fill. So why does this study matters? There are four reasons I'd like to walk you through. The first is that shared meals have always done something important for us. As studies mentioned, sitting down to eat with other people supports our sense of belonging, our trust in others, and our overall well-being. But increasingly shared meals are being replaced by solitary screen-paired eating, and that quiet cultural shift is worth paying attention to. The second reason is more sobering. A meta-analysis study supported by the World Health Organization's 2022 report found that perceived social isolation, that feeling of not being meaningfully connected, predicts mortality rate on par with major physical risk factors like smoking or obesity. That means the everyday behaviors that might shape isolation are genuinely worth examining closely. Third, there's a clear gap in the literature. Most existing research on mealtime screens has looked at physical outcomes like food intake, weight, attention. But as research points out, no study yet has linked mealtime screen use to validated measure of loneliness, well-being, and social connectedness in adults. And finally, the relevance for counseling. Loneliness, low mood, and sense of disconnection are among the most common concerns that clients bring into therapy. So, if we can clarify whether mealtime screen use is or isn't a meaningful warning sign, it directly helps practitioners read their clients' relational goals more accurately. With that background in place, the main question my study set out to explore was: is digital engagement during eating associated with loneliness, mental well being, and social connectedness in adults? From this single question, three hypotheses were tested. These were: digital engagement during eating will be significantly correlated with first one, loneliness, second one, mental well-being, and third one, social connectedness. These three were tested separately against its own validated measure. Why does this answering this matter? Because if mealtime screen use does turn out to be a meaningful marker of loneliness or disconnection, it gives counselors a useful signal to listen out for. And if it doesn't, then that's just as valuable to know, because it stops us from making assumptions about clients' habits that aren't actually supported by evidence. Now let me walk you through the methods. This was an online quantitative cross-sectional correlational study hosted on SiteToolkit. There were four main variables of interest: digital engagement during eating, loneliness, mental well-being, and social connectedness. Sex, gender, and age were also recorded as controls. In total, 109 participants' data were analyzed. They ranged in age from 18 to 56 years old, with an average mean of 22.29 years. Standard deviation was 6.78. Participants were recruited through SONA, which is Bangalore's research participation system, and along with social media, word of mouth, and SiteToolkit user board. Four measures were used. The first was a bespoke digital engagement during eating scale that was developed specifically for the study, as no validated measure of this exact behavior currently exists. The other three were well-established questionnaires: the UCLA Loneliness Scale version 3 by Russell, 1996, the Warwick-Edinburgh Mental Well-being Scale by Tennant et al., 2007, and the Social Connectedness Scale revised by Lee and Robbins, 1995. Each of these was slightly modified for consistency across the questionnaire, and importantly, every single item gave participants a prefer not to answer option, so they always had a way out of if a question felt too sensitive. Participants accessed the questionnaire through a link, completed everything in a single sitting, which took about 20 to 30 minutes. They were provided with an information sheet and a consent form, then answered some demographic questions before moving through the four main measures. Afterwards, they were taken to a debrief page that signposted support services in case anything had brought up difficult feelings. The whole questionnaire was made available in both English and Welsh for inclusivity, and the whole study received ethical approval from Bangalore University. I will talk you through the results. None of the three hypotheses were supported. For hypothesis 1, digital engagement and loneliness, RS is equal to 0.05 with P is equal to 0.642. That's a tiny correlation, and the p-value is way above 0.05, so this was clearly not significant. For hypothesis 2, digital engagement and well-being, RS is equal to minus 0.07 with P is equal to 0.456. The minus sign just tells us the relationship was in the predicted direction, but it's still very small, and again, it's not significant. And for hypothesis 3, digital engagement and social connectedness, RS is equal to 0.11 with P is equal to 0.260. Same story, small in prediction direction, but not significant. Looking at the descriptive side, the most common mealtime behaviors by far were watching TV or films with an average score of 2.98, followed by scrolling social media with an average of 2.31. Phone calls, video calls, and gaming were much less common at mealtimes. And here's the most striking part of the findings. 3 psychological outcomes themselves, loneliness, well-being, and social connectedness, were very strongly correlated to one another, with correlations of 0.54 up to 0.87, with p-values below 0.001. What that tells us is that the measures themselves were working perfectly well. They simply did not move with the mealtime screen variable. The bar chart on the right shows this visually. The larger bars are how strongly the 3 outcomes related to each other, and the much smaller bars below are how weakly they are related to screen use during mealtimes. Discussion. As we just saw, none of the 3 hypotheses were supported. Mealtime screen use wasn't significantly related to loneliness, well-being, or social connectedness. The small patterns that did appear in the data were too small to be meaningful, more likely down to random variation than to anything real. At the same time, loneliness, well-being, and social connectedness were strongly tied to each other, which is consistent with the wider literature. Interpretation. The null finding makes sense when you sit with it. Mealtime screen use is a short, bounded act, usually 20 to 40 minutes. It may simply not carry the same psychological risk as the kind of heavy daily screen use that's been studied elsewhere. As studies have argued, the presence of another person, even a quiet one, may carry far more weight than the device. There is also a methodological reason why the study finding may have come out null. 5 very different behaviors were combined into a single score. These activities are not psychologically equivalent. A video call with a close friend is active and connecting. A solo gaming session is much more passive and isolating. By combining them, it may have masked opposite direction effects that cancel each other out, something studies have warned about in similar contexts. So, what do these findings actually mean in practice? The first implication is significant. On the basis of this evidence, mealtime screen use should not be treated as a reliable warning sign of loneliness, low mood, or social disconnection. If a client tells you they watch something during their meals, that alone isn't enough to draw clinical conclusions from. Following from that, the second implication is that blanket advice to give up screens at meals isn't supported by these findings. In fact, giving that kind of advice carries a real risk of adding unnecessary shame to a very ordinary everyday behavior. Most of us do this, many of our clients do this, and there is no evidence here that it's harming them. The third and most useful implication is that we should redirect the clinical question. Instead of asking about the screen, we should ask about the social context of the meal itself, who the client eats with, how often they eat with others, and how those meals feel. That kind of question opens a far richer window into a client's relational world. This study makes 3 contributions into the wider literature. First, it is one of the studies to examine digital engagement during eating using validated measures of loneliness, well-being, and social connectedness in an adult sample. Second, it provides a bespoke 9-item questionnaire that could become a standard measure for this specific behavior in the future research. And third, it adds to the emerging literature on digital commensality, gently reframing the conversation away from the screens themselves and towards wider relational context of the meals around them. Like every research, this study has its own limitations. With only 109 participants, most of whom were young, female, and connected to a university, these findings really can't be generalized to everyone. Older adults, parents, people who live alone, and people from very different cultural backgrounds may experience mealtime screen in completely different ways. And this data cannot speak to that. The digital engagement scale had a reliability score, what's called a Cronbach's alpha of 0.46. In plain language, Cronbach's alpha tells us how consistently the items in a scale are measuring the same underlying thing, and above 0.7 is usually the accepted threshold for acceptable reliability. This fell short largely because the scale tried to capture 5 very different behaviors in one score, and the small modifications made to the other established questionnaires means the score cannot be directly compared to published norms. The study captured one moment in a time and relied entirely on self-report. That means it can only tell us about associations, not about cause and effect. And self-report itself is always shaped a little bit by memory and the desire to be seen in a particular way. Participants were asked about their main meal of the day without specifying which, so breakfast, lunch, and dinner may all have been blurred together. And as I mentioned in the discussion, combining the 5 digital behaviors into one score may have hidden effects that were pulling in opposite direction. Further studies. Future research could take this bespoke 9-item questionnaire and develop it into a fully validated scale and crucially examine each form of digital engagement separately. As studies have shown, active and passive uses of media can have very different effects on well-being. Longitudinal study, which follows the same participants over weeks or months, experience sampling, which asks people about their day in the moment as it's happening, or even brief screen-free meal intervention studies would all help us capture direction of effects and show how mealtime habits unfold in real life, not just in a single questionnaire. Combining qualitative methods with broader sample. Interviews or focus groups, particularly with older adults, parents, people who live alone, and people from different cultural backgrounds, would surface the meaning and context that a numerical questionnaire simply cannot capture. To bring this work directly into counseling practice, a study that follows clients through therapy, tracking whether changes in their mealtime habits go alongside broader changes in well-being, would link the digital commensality literature much more directly to everyday clinical work that we actually do. Before I close, I'd like to leave this message. Screens at mealtimes aren't a reliable warning sign of loneliness or poor well-being. Counselors should focus on the social context of eating, not the screen itself, because it's the connections that matters. Here are the list of references which was used in this presentation. Please feel free to pause the video here to have a closer look if you'd like. Thank you so much for taking the time to listen to my presentation and watching this video today. If you'd like to share any thoughts, questions, or reflections, my email is on the slide. Thank you once again and take care.